Of all my Antweight robots, that is 150-gram robots that must fit within the confines of a 4-inch cube, Polaris is perhaps my best known, and also is the oldest functioning robot in my fleet today as of this video going live. Its design is inspired by that of the robot of the same name that appears in my webcomic series Transmission, where the team enters a fictitious depiction of Robot Wars. I always liked the idea of doing a front-hinge flipper because I always loved the design of robots like Cassius 2 and latterly Push to Exit. That, and there aren't nearly as many of them going around as there are for certain other weapons. In early 2018 I set to work on the earliest scale drawings, and because I hadn't built any robot yet at that point and lacked the knowledge of computer-aided design, I commissioned Harry of Team Panoramic to do the CAD and build me the robot while I sourced the ESC receiver and server for the flipper. Polaris Mark 1 was completed in July 2018 and fought its first event, my first event as a competitor that autumn, at Antweight World Series 56 in Bristol. The robot won 2 fights and lost 2, going out in hilarious fashion against Dietant when it got flipped onto its back and stranded there. 2 days later, I took Polaris to Northern Ireland to partake in the first International Inferno episode of Antweight Anarchy, representing Scotland. Polaris would make it to the final, losing to Nexus after very nearly going the distance. One major issue the robot had was that the flipper didn't have enough kick to self-right, so I had to tape a plastic fin on top to allow it to do so. In 2019 I added polycarbonate struts to the back to prevent the robot from being stranded on its back, but in doing so I had to remove the top fin because it would prevent the robot from fitting inside that 4-inch cube. So, at Antweight World Series 58 that June, I tried my luck, and the robot went 2 for 2 again, the 2 fights it lost tellingly as a result of the inability to self-right. I handed the robot back to Harry so he could wire the flipper's servo directly to the battery to give it more punch. To my surprise, at RoboNerd 2019 he turned up with the robot now in a new Mark II chassis, allowing for easier maintenance and the ability to self-right. Sadly, this version wouldn't see an actual tournament, as the following year the COVID pandemic hit, and by the middle of 2020 I decided to redesign the robot to reflect my style better. Polaris Mark III had an experimental ABS chassis that was bolted together and held bits of polycarbonate for armour. Like its predecessor, it didn't compete in any tournaments, but it fought whiteboards outside during the lockdowns and at RoboNerd 2021. The robot looked cool and the flipper had much more kick that allowed it to self-right easily, but I could tell that the chassis wouldn't be able to stand up to the big spinners, so a redesign was once again in order. Polaris Mark IV would be built from a shatterproof nylon chassis and would have HDPE and Lexan panels bolted on for protection. The design closely resembled that of its Beetleweight counterpart, Snowdrop. Competing at Antweight World Series 62, the robot sadly didn't do well. Because of the cube rule, it was too long to have acetate on the front, and the nylon chassis warped, so Polaris lost both its fights due to losing the ground game. Back to the drawing board again. The following spring of 2022 saw the arrival of Polaris Mark V, which was basically Mark III and Mark IV designs merged together in a way. The robot was shorter and taller to conform to the cube rule better, and the flipper was now made from grade 5 titanium. After whiteboarding at Confuzzled and then RoboNerd for practice, Mark V got its first tournament at Antweight World Series 65, which saw Polaris see its strongest run in any tournament it's competed in, winning 3 fights. It was durable and held up well against robots with spinning weapons, however it was light at the front and prone to doing wheelies, which was less than ideal when taking on other wedges. At Antweight World Series 66 it didn't do so well, going winless again, but at least putting up a good fights each time. Its most recent tournament was Scar 4, where it won 1 and lost 1, and while getting a bye for the third fight when the opponent dropped out, it didn't do well enough to progress through to the knockout rounds. Polaris Mark V is now 2 years old, but still uses the same internals as all the previous builds did over the past 6 years. Now showing its age, and with the arrival of new designs in my Antweight fleet, this build too is now destined for retirement from main events, but still has seen action in whiteboards at the likes of last year's Ferry Fair and RoboNerd. The chassis of Polaris Mark I, meanwhile, is still in use today, having been donated to Anthony Murney of Team Penny, who has since recommissioned the robot and has it fighting in his Mecha Mayhem tournaments in Northern Ireland, which is pretty cool in itself. And as for whether there will be a Polaris Mark VI, well, never say never.